right, I think we'll go ahead and begin. We don't want to wait too long. Welcome everybody, to those of you who are just still entering the room. On behalf of my colleagues at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, which is also known as SIMS, I'm delighted to welcome everybody here. My name is Lynn Ransom, and I'm the curator of programs here at SIMS. So today's lecture, which features the remarkable Daniel Wakelin, marks the end of this year's online lecture series, which we began really over a year ago in response to the shutdown as a means of bringing scholars to our virtual table to share and discuss research and projects that advance global manuscript studies. These lectures have taken us from the monastery of St. Catherine's at Sinai, with our first lecture by Professor Claudia Rapp, to the caves, the Dunhuang caves in China. And we have considered topics ranging from the loss and recovery of a piece of Armenia's cultural and intellectual heritage to the trade of manuscripts across the Atlantic in the early 20th century. And SIMS's own Nicholas Herman has revealed last summer his recent discovery of a new miniature by the French illuminator Jean Baudouchon. We've also heard about new digital tools, technologies, and approaches to global manuscript studies that have encouraged us to rethink old questions and to ask new ones. And it has been a really successful series for SIMS, allowing us to reach a wider and more diverse audience in spite of, or perhaps because of, these strange times that we find ourselves in. And we're grateful that so many of you have been able to join us throughout the year to participate in these conversations that the lecturers have started and to further SIMS missions to bring manuscripts, modern technology, and people together. All of the lectures have been recorded and they're available all now on the SIMS YouTube channel to view anytime. After today's lecture, we're going to take a pause this summer, but we'll start the program up again in the fall. So please keep an eye out, follow us on Twitter. You can sign up for a newsletter to hear more about future events. And I'll be adding these links in the chat with more information about SIMS and how to follow us. One more thing before we begin today's program, I want to mention that our call for applications for the 2022-2023 Visiting Research Fellowship will close on May 15th. This is an opportunity for scholars with a research interest in SIMS pre-modern manuscript or digital collections to come to Penn for a month and engage with a network of resources and opportunities and people for collaboration. If you're interested in hearing more or have questions, please don't hesitate to contact me or any of my colleagues at SIMS. Finally, I do want to remind you that we're recording this lecture and we will be posting it to the YouTube channel in the next week or so. So with that, I'd like to turn to the reason that we're all here, and that is the lecture presented by our speaker, Daniel Wakelin, whom we are very excited to welcome today. Professor Wakelin is the Jeremy Griffiths Professor of Medieval English Paleography at the University of Oxford and Fellow at St. Hilda's College. Known for his particularly nuanced and insightful studies and interpretation of scribal practices in and readership of medieval literary manuscripts, Professor Wakelin masterfully combines literary criticism with its expertise in paleography and codicology to reveal not only how scribes wrote, but why and how their practices reflect intentional and informed choices in regard to the text being copied. Among his many publications are Scribal Correction and Literary Craft, English Manuscripts 1375 to 1510, which was a joint winner of the Sharp DeLong Prize for Book History in 2015, and the imminently forthcoming, and I think forthcoming in the next couple of days, a book entitled Immaterial Text in Late Medieval England, Making English Literary Manuscripts 1400 to 1500. And I believe that this talk will be a bit of a preview of that. So I could go on into great length on his many other publications and his many contributions to the profession, but for the sake of time and your patience, I will end here so that we can hear from the man himself. Professor Wakelin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for a very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to come virtually to Penn today, because Penn is very much indeed the sort of the home of the study of the material text. Indeed, I think probably the coining of that phrase, which is one that I want to think about a little bit today, and one that's alluded to in the title of the book that Lynn very kindly mentioned. I want today to talk about scribes' attitudes to one aspect of the material text. And I'm going to be focusing on manuscripts in English, by and large, of the 1400s. I'll just share my slides. As Lynn mentioned, this is the subject of a book that I'll be publishing soon. It supposedly comes out at the start of May, called Immaterial Texts in Late Medieval England. And I very materialistically used this occasion to offer a kind of trailer of coming attractions or distractions. And perhaps materialistically, I hope that Lynn will be able to share in the chat function a flyer enabling you to get a discount on the book as well. Apologies for this shameless mercantilist behavior. As that book's title suggests, I focus in it not only on scribes' physical materials, but also on their ideas and intentions, on their immaterial thinking, the thinking which informs their handling of their materials. I study scribes then not only making, but as thinking people. Thinking is part of what craftspeople do, and a lot of my research has been about recovering their thinking processes. There are three senses in which their ideas are immaterial, and I'll just put this slide up while I briefly run through what the book says in general. First, in the book, I stress that material manuscripts are informed or given form by immaterial ideas in the mind of scribes, readers, patrons, and their wider community. In their handling of matter, the scribes work in a way, I suggest, that philosophers would call hylomorphic, fitting the material to their ideas, often despite the material's properties. Indeed, the makers of manuscripts in English in the 1400s sometimes seem a little resistant to the materiality of the text. Second, I stress that scribes and their readers conceptualized texts themselves as having an immaterial existence, available not only, or indeed perfectly, in material books, but experienced also in processes of reading, perhaps in the ear, as uncovered by Joyce Coleman in her work on reading aloud, or in the mind. Third, the scribes' ideas, their traditions and conventions for handling matter, their ideas of texts as immaterial, all those ideas, I suggest, are themselves, strictly speaking, immaterial, largely absent from our written evidence. English scribes of the 1400s passed on their skills by word of mouth for the most part, and if they articulated their hylomorphism or their theory of textuality, they wouldn't have used those words, which English did not yet possess. There are a few useful written sources, notably the recipes for book crafts, recently edited by Mark Clark and analysed by Carrie Griffin, Hannah Riley, Eleanor Baker, and others. And there are a few monastic and other institutional instructions, and a few of what Kathleen Scott once called book-producing terms in situ, brief instructions from one craftsperson to another, scribbled into flyleaves and margins. But those sources are rare in occurrence, restricted in extent, and riddling in their meaning. Therefore, ironically, I need to reconstruct the immaterial ideas of scribes by analysing very material evidence, more like an archaeologist, to infer from objects the concepts which underpinned their making, but went unexpressed. This is what the folklorist Henry Glassy called the wordless experience of people who never wrote down their thinking, ideas only cumbersomely formed in language, but gracefully shaped into artifacts. Now, of course, the artifacts made by scribes are not usually wordless. They're full of words, but those words are not the scribe's own by and large, nor are they, by and large, with exceptions, about the artifacts themselves. Therefore, I've been exploring their immaterial thinking from their material evidence, as I said. In the book, there are chapters about their handling of parchment, about their ruling of pages, about the turning of leaves, which I'm going to talk about today, from the supplying of paratexts, especially annotations on poetry, and from the copying or miscopying of texts. In the short time today, I'm just going to focus on one of those examples, as I said. I'm explicitly going to explore an attitude of vexation about the material construction of books and an interest in the immaterial process of reading poetry, which occurs beyond and despite the limits of the page. I'm going to focus on how scribes and readers dealt with page breaks. It's a teasing topic because late medieval people did not have our word for page, except perhaps in one stray reference, nor obvious equivalents. They even translate the related but not identical Latin word pagina as book. So it's difficult to know how they talked about or thought about pages. They do use the word leaf for the physical three-dimensional double-sided flap of parchment or paper. And they do use words like side, or more rarely half, to refer to one side of the leaf. That seems to be their only pair of words for the page. But note that calling a page a side or a half implies that you only have a part of the whole, just one bit, rather than the thing entire. And in fact, comments on the leaf or the side seem to crop up mostly when people are explicitly complaining that what they can see on one side or one leaf of the leaf is insufficient and that one needs to turn the page to find the rest, as here, for instance, when a table is on the next side of the next leaf. A single page is never enough. I've put some such complaints on the screen, such as from Langland. There's a lament that somebody lacked a cunning clerk who could have turned the leaf. It's a complaint about a lazy reader who finds what she likes on one page and doesn't turn to the next to find it clarified. The human ability to understand other minds, in my second quotation, is compared to books where you can see what is in the margin, but what is on the t'other side, on the other side, is hid. The metaphor for misunderstanding works because the page, as only one half, is imagined as something which skews or obscures our perceptions of the text as a whole. That implication reminds me of one slightly quirky question raised by a couple of recent writers. Might the material format of the page, of the division into pages, be either irrelevant to the text or even harmful to it? Might it even be a bad thing? This has been hinted at by D. Vance Smith, who takes from the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot the warning that the physical form of the codex hides and is deeply inimical to literary form. The Argentinian novelist Alberto Manguel describes a struggle between the reader's comprehension of the text and the page as an imperfect vehicle for the text. He says they're in a sort of struggle, and he adds, usually it is the page that wins. This seems to me a point that, while in some ways obvious, is seldom articulated, that the page might be antithetical to reading. I'm going to suggest that medieval scribes and readers often, but definitely not always, but often felt the same. They felt that in some kinds of work, the division into pages did not complement, but disrupted the experience of reading. That's my historical speculation today. And that also has, I suggest, an implication for our methodology in studying the material texts. Literary studies, influenced by the pioneering work of Penn in particular, has tended lately to think of literary works as material texts, where the physical and visual form of the book complements the verbal content, or where that form fits function. But what happens when form does not really complement the content or the function? That's a question that's hinted at in the close of my Oxford colleague Adam Smythe's recent book on Elizabethan and Stuart printing. It's called Material Texts in Early Modern England. And flipping his title round, I'd like to take up that puzzle by thinking about page breaks as a place where form and content don't quite fit. Now, as I said, this is not always the case. This is just sometimes, and I want to start by reminding ourselves of the many remarkable books in which material format and intellectual structure are in perfect harmony. For instance, they often clearly are in calendars, diagrams, and finding aids, as in some of the scientific manuscripts for which the Schoenberg collection is so famous. So I want to acknowledge this sort of thing first, but also note the limited extent of such harmonious design. For calendars, say, in codex books, as in almanacs, the single page is used to divide up the text into single months. It's still common today to have a page per month, at a glance. And dividing units of time across units of space makes sort of some kind of cognitive sense. Single pages and openings can also contribute to elaborate astronomical tables, for instance. But the calendars with page per month that we still know are not mathematically ideal, for not all months are the same size, whereas pages generally are in a book. So some of the ruling has to go unused in February on the left here, and then they have to fill the space with something else. Moreover, the calendar does not require the use of a page to function. Calendars could also be copied into other formats, for instance, here on a roll, right, quite unusually, where the months uncurl one after another. So even as fitting and enduring and as commonsensical a format as page per month calendars is not immutable. That form is not deterministic technologically. Something similar holds for finding aids, such as indexes and tables of contents. A couple of them from England in the 1400s do cite topics by the leaf usually, or sometimes rarely by the page, like this one added in 1485 to a herbal. Authors could in theory plan for that. So this poem, translated from classical Latin, has a regular 4 stanzas per page, as you can see on the right, and the stanzas are lettered throughout, A to H over each leaf, and they're then referred to in an index of topics here on the left. Unequivocally here, the exact page breaks and page layout is vital to make this index work. But these examples are not perfect, and they're also not the only ones they are almost the only ones I can think of in English from this period, where a finding aid refers to particular pages. Much more commonly, medieval indexes, tables of contents, referred to not to the physical leaf or page, but to the intellectual structure of the text, the chapter, the liber, the separate recipe, and so on. That was much more workable because each manuscript copy of a text might differ from the others in the places where page breaks fall. So indexes had to be functional from one copy to the next, and Blair's written well about this. That slightly lessens the supposed searchability of the codex as a structure, and it lessens the importance of the page, I think. So even among calendars and finding aids, where the leaf or page could be useful for organizing information, there are many, many counterexamples where it was not so used. Now, if you're the scribe making the book, nor was the page central to your endeavor, in Codicology 101, the first thing you learn is that it's the quire that matters to the scribe. Oh, sorry, that's a contents page without page references. It's the quire that matters to the scribe, because scribes don't make a page at a time. You can do that in Microsoft Word. You can't do it with a physical book at all. You've always got to physically make 2 pages at a minimum, back to back at one time, as a piece of stuff, of material. And in fact, in the late Middle Ages, as a rule, in 99% of occasions, people made 4 pages at a time by making a bifolium with 4 pages on 2 leaves, which they then swapped together, like in this book that fell apart. So that means that in one of its basic features of the codex, the number of pages, there's an ill fit of form to content, because very rarely is the text going to require exactly a multiple of 4 pages to be copied. There are blank leaves and so on and so forth. Nor did the scribes usually copy their exemplars, the copy of the species of the text from which they are working, page by page, duplicating its pagination as in a photocopy or facsimile. The number of cases where they tried to do so is almost countable. It's so few, at least the ones we can identify. And when they did that, they often did it wrongly in some spectacular ways. Even in verse, where lines of text could be counted out from one page in one copy to a page from the pages in exemplar, the duplication of page divisions is rare. For instance, 5 copies of Lydgate's Troy book have related pictures, layout, and decor, but they have ruling for 2 fewer lines per page in one copy rather than the other. So the page divides go out of synchrony immediately and rapidly become very much out of sync. It would have been labor-saving, you'd have thought, to keep the page breaks in the same places. But for whatever reason, scribes seldom did so. They didn't exploit the page in their material process of making. Yet, and I'm still running through these counterexamples, scribes did sometimes highlight the page's dimensions in ways which draw attention to their own craftsmanship. They do this by decorating the edges of pages. As well as illuminated borders, which highlight new texts or textual sections, they add decorative penwork, which highlight nothing but the tops and bottoms of pages. They draw calligraphic letters on the top line, even in quite hastily made books, or along the bottom as well. Some of these marks clearly needed an extra stroke of a pen, as I think has happened here, and some feel more organic, as though the empty margin just was too tempting for the pen not to stray into it, especially when working quickly, perhaps. Some of those letters are just lengthened or trailed off. Others have more elaborate shapes. And from the 1430s on, they often have elaborate horizontal hatching or a crisscross pattern that we know as strapwork or as cadelles. And these decorations can draw the eye away from the text and by visual contrast into the blank space which surrounds and interrupts the text. The motives for such decoration can be well speculated about in a history of bookmaking as a business. It makes the page a luxury commodity to be appreciated as an object, almost irrespective of what the words say. As for instance, in this specimen from the renowned scribe Ricardus Franciscus in a manuscript from the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. But this framing of the page as a commodity or craft achievement has only an oblique connection to the text. For instance, on this page, a heart has been drawn on the word do, not a notably hearty sort of word, and a scroll has been drawn on 4 random words such as stretch and night. The pictures don't emphasize particular words meaningfully. It's hard to find a semantic connection, though it's very tempting to try. There is, however, one witting or unwitting irony in one image common in these decorated letters at page edges: the use of scrolls, a bit like the banderoles or speech bubbles that we get in medieval pictures. You can see some here, these scrolls wrapped around the ascenders. Martha Dana Rust of NYU noted rather brilliantly that they give the letters a 3-dimensional quality, a depth of field that makes the page vivid as an artifact in its own right. On the other hand, a scroll is an ironic thing to depict at the edge of a page, for a scroll is the antithesis of a page. It has far fewer material breaks, so that words can flow interrupted for a little bit longer. In this same book by Ricardus Franciscus, we've got a picture of some clerks writing on rolls with such a flow, for instance. You could say, perhaps, that as Ricardus Franciscus frames the page as his work of art in its own right, he also alludes to a format which avoids these divisions, or even evokes the immaterial medium of speech. For what I want to suggest in the second and main part of my talk today is that these moments where scribes fanfare the page as an artifact coexist alongside moments where they seem rather wary of it. As well as scribes who exploit the material page, some seem to strive to transcend it. That emerges especially if we turn away from the eye-catching decorations and complicated paratexts, which are more often the subject of manuscript studies, because they're absorbing and interesting, but turn instead to much plainer books, especially plain old books of prose, which will be most of my examples next. Prose has a funny relationship with the page, uneasier than that of verse. In verse, when it's set out line by line, as it is in late medieval England, wherever a scribe puts a page break, it's going to fall where there's some sort of break in the textual form, in the meter. And in Middle English, that's often going to be a break in syntax too, as a lot of poetry has syntactical breaks at line breaks. But a scribe can't really do that in prose very often. In prose, the page break can come anywhere between any old pair of words. Now, on the one hand, for the scribe, that's extremely liberating. He has less need to plan a particular layout. But for the reader, it's a bit irritating, because the page break is not guaranteed to offer any support for sense, syntax, or structure from sentence to paragraph or chapter, and it might even undermine their integrity, visibility, or audibility. Now, apologies for that rather abstract account of copying prose. We're now going to look at what that means in practice for some scribes. Only a few, but not so few to be just one-offs. These scribes worry and take practical measures to interfere at the page breaks, which interrupt prose. This is evident in a few phenomena. The first phenomenon is familiar from typography and desktop publishing, and if you use Word, you'll see similar terms. The avoidance of what have sometimes been called widows, but which I'm going to call orphans, which seems just about the more familiar term in the history of typography. An orphan is when a subsection, a book or a chapter or a single recipe or whatever else, begins with just a few words at the bottom of one page or ends with just a few words at the top of another page, separated from the bulk of the textual unit to which it belongs. Neither widow nor orphan is a kind metaphor, and each is inconsistently used in modern sources. Neither seems to be a medieval term, but whatever they were called, 15th century printers were already altering their texts, as we can tell when their exemplars survive, to avoid such orphans. And the phenomena of avoiding orphans are well attested in manuscripts of the 1400s. The scribes are inconsistent. Not all avoid them, and those who do so only now and then, differing in their practice from page to page, even within the same book. But several scribes try. Sometimes scribes allow these orphans on one page and avoid them on another. But when they avoid them, there are various techniques. They often squeeze extra text at the foot of a page before a new chapter starts, or a new prose paragraph of some kind. In another technique, the scribes avoid using the bottom of the page when they would otherwise start a new section near the foot. Now, there can be a good practical reason for that, as here, when the scribe has to add something too large for the space, a big table of figures, which he has to move on to the next page. Tidiness is especially important in works of education and science and instruction, which use textual divisions rather carefully to cluster information or to divide it up. So in bilingual grammars and phrase books, for example, known as Vulgaria, scribes must finish the English explanation before beginning the Latin example, or vice versa. So here, a scribe finishes the Latin example of showing the use of the ablative case on one page with an overrun. The Latin says, "This staff is 3 feet long and not 1 thumb length longer." But the Latin is 1 thumb length longer than the line available, and so it must be finished in the margin below, or in the bottom margin below, before the grammatical explanation of what the ablative is starts over leaf on the top right of this screen. It's not surprising that in texts about composing good language, there's attention to composing a good page design as well. But it also happens in medical texts, for instance, this collection of remedies. Sometimes the scribe continues far to the bottom margin, and sometimes he stops before he's finished the page so that each remedy ends complete on one page without crossing it at the break or starting a new one too soon. So we've got both things going on here. 5 of the remedies which thereby finish on the page complete, end by announcing that the patient shall be whole, or tell the medic to keep treating him till he be whole. That's sort of rather ironically fitting here, but you can imagine all sorts of painful consequences were one to miss the start or end of a medical procedure because it was on a different leaf, if you were to forget to turn over before the final clue on how to operate on the patient. The patient and text both need to be whole. I should say that on the right, below shall be whole, there's some text added much later in a later century, jotted below. This avoidance of orphans, that's ugly. This avoidance of orphans marks some ambivalence about page breaks. They can harmonize with breaks in textual form, what linguists call information structure, but they can also interrupt language and ideas. The ambivalence manifests itself in the use of overruns, of little extra bits of text, used not only to avoid orphans at the start and ends of sections, but even in the middle of continuous prose sentences. For instance, in one bilingual phrasebook, which I was not allowed to photograph, there are 8 overruns which make the page break coincide with the shift between languages, like those we've seen. But there are 2 more which occur within a speech in one or another language. I cannot tell, and then on the next page over leaf, furthermore, I hear say. There are 5 lines of English, furthermore, to go on in this example. That happens in longer works of prose too. For instance, one scribe of some sermons in the Bodleian Library has many, many overruns like this, and also 4 times squeezes words on the ends of pages into the margin in order to sort of round out a homily. Ironically, the words squashed at the bottom margin of this page are only the closing Latin formula, quicum Deo et Spiritu Sanctu vivit et regnat in secula seculorum, abbreviated to just a few words, quicum Deo, etc. And you can just about see the et, and then the s of etc. has been cut off by the Bodleians inept 17th century binder who destroyed a lot of this book, in fact. It was presumably known, this Latin formula was presumably known to preachers by memory, so that you don't really need to write it out at all. But decorum might demand that this final phrase be alluded to at the end of the homily, and finishing on one page might be more convenient for somebody preaching than finishing over leaf. Usually, these overruns suggest that scribes envisaged page breaks as problems for readers in this way. The ease of readers seems a concern when scribes use overruns to avoid splitting a single word across a page break in the middle of a piece of continuous prose. Scribes are usually happy with words straddling line breaks within one page, but they don't like them straddling page breaks across 2 pages. So they complete the last words with an overrun below the text block or by letting them straggle into the margin, upsetting the justification, as we also call it in Word. You can see that going on 4 times in this copy of the Dicts and Sayings of the Philosophers, where we have the end of things not quite ending so neatly here, or 16 times in this book of religious prose from early 15th century London. All these words could have crossed page breaks and been a little bit legible. Indeed, this scribe of religious prose does allow the word harnessed, which I don't have a photograph, but it's bottom left, the word harness to straddle a page break, harnessing the pages. But it makes sense that for the grammar of legibility, that words should not cross page breaks if possible, because they are legible, but less legible that way. And it's worth noting the implicit attitude to the page in this spatial grammar. These overruns don't help the scribe achieve a tidy layout of the material book as commodity, or an elegant page, unlike those flourishes at the top of pages, for they disrupt the neat rectangle of text. And some of scribes, rather like this one here, seem to like decorating that neat rectangle of text with these flourishes at top and bottom. Rather than make the page as a format coincide with the text conceptual form, they override the page's aesthetic potential. Nor can it be argued that they exploit the page break, making a virtue of necessity to synchronize with breaks in the textual structure, as when people avoid orphans, because the syntax just carries on across the page break, even if the single word itself has been finished off. Rather, they simply help people to read the text a little bit more easily, despite the material format of the book. A sense that the page, though sometimes pretty, though sometimes a great material commodity, is a hindrance to the immaterial experience of reading, emerges for me in that set of, as another decorative page, in that set of sermons that I mentioned with lots of these overruns. Besides one of them, the scribe rounds out a sort of phrase, but then he adds the extra Latin phrase, verte folium, or turn the leaf. And so he's worried that he's finished off with a bit too much finality in this case, and he has to remind the preacher to keep going. Like, don't stop here, there's more. PTO, as we write at the bottom of pages. I'm going to come back to verte folium in my final moments, but before that, I wanted to note some more unease about the page break in another phenomenon that looks a bit similar in its arrangement on the page, but is quite different in its working. It's similar to, in appearance, to catchwords, which are well known, of course, to codicology. They're the markings that tell binders which order the choirs go in. So they're the last words of, the first words of one choir that appear in the last position of the preceding choir, as here. So they're just a help to binding, and they only appear in that position. But additional marks that look a bit like catchwords, giving the first syllable or words of the next page, occur in some books, not just at the end of choirs, but elsewhere. From the 1520s to the 1700s, they were often used on every single page in printed books. And one 17th century printer, Joseph Moxon, calls them directions. I'm going to borrow that word directions from Moxon because they've seldom been discussed in manuscripts, and I don't know of a better word for them. If anybody else does, I'd be rather grateful. They can occur on the front or recto of the leaf when there's no way that they could help keeping the leaves in order. For instance, in this copy of the Prose Brut, they're on rectos, indicating what's going to carry on when you turn over. And in that set of sermons with verte folium, The scribe writes these needless catchwords, these directions, on some 64 versos and 96 rectos. What on earth are they for? They seem to me most likely to help reading without interruption from one page to the next, as though the page break were an impediment. That interruption, I'll go back a second, sorry, it might be especially strongly felt in a text read aloud, like these sermons. The worry about interrupted reading emerges in some of the linguistic detail and visual setting of other directions. First, they're almost always in prose and hardly ever in lineated verse. In fact, I think I've only ever found one in verse, and there's something fishy about that example as well. In prose, by contrast, because the break seldom coincides with break of page, seldom coincides with any break of the text, directions sustain the text, sense and syntax over the break. That emerges in the largest number known to me of these directions in two closely related copies of John Trevisa's English translation of the Universal History, the Polychronicon. Emily Steiner of Penn has just published a great book on Trevisa's work, which I recommend to everyone. One manuscript of the Polychronicon has directions on 531 of its 620 pages, on recto and verso alike, occurring no matter where in sentence or chapter, except in the contents list where there is no continuous reading as such. For instance, one side of an opening, as here, ends with a direction of two words, saying north cedar, north side at the foot. It tells how the Scots made them a place fast or close by the Picts in the north side, and the next side starts north side of that arm of the sea that breaketh into the land. The handwriting of these directions is pretty informal. They might be casual cues to the copyist telling himself where to pick up tomorrow, but it seems odd to do it on 5/6 of the pages, if so. But they prevent uninterrupted reading by someone, whether scribe or a reader, as we usually use the term. And the way that they help in interrupted reading is evident from another copy, a second copy of the Polychronicon, which was either copied from this one or from a shared exemplar that's now lost. This has fewer of these directions, but it still has 86 of them, and most of them repeat one or two whole words to complete clauses or smaller tied units of syntax. For instance, on the left-hand side, in the middle of a quire, so these leaves are joined together, you don't need to, there's no help in shuffling the leaves here. On the left-hand side, in the middle of a quire, Trevisa says, the Jews are eaten to forehound in the manner of bidders from the left cedar to the right cedar, to the right side. And on the facing right-hand side, the line continues, recht cedar, and from the recht cedar to the left. So joining the two sides with the repetition of the word side. In this book, where they're more selective, they usually tie together parts of speech that can't stand alone in English. The article, the, and then the adjective and noun, right side after it, or the adjective to its noun in some other instances, or a conjunction such as and but with the clause it conjoins, or occasionally two balancing ideas, kind of on the one hand this, and then they have one of these directions because the next page is on the other hand that. The way that they aid the reading of incomplete text is evident in 7 of them in this book, which finish off words incomplete at the page break. It's as if the unfinished syntax or unfinished words could be difficult to parse, to copy out, or to voice when they occur over page breaks. Of course, such words outside the main rectangle of text might disturb the reader's eye, but they are meant to be noticed. Some are decorated in red in this copy, as you can see on the left, as they are in some other books, such as this copy of Mandeville's Travels, with directions on little scrolls. The use of a scroll probably reflects the likeness of these directions to catchwords, which are often decorated in this way at the end of quires. But as I said once earlier, the scroll has another effect, intentional or not. It evokes the flow of text along a roll, unbroken by breaks in pages. For these directions, like overruns, draw attention to the page break in order to transcend it. Now, it must be said, neither the overruns to complete one page nor the directions to warn what's on the next are common. They each occur in only a handful of books and only patchily in most of those books. Often one scribe worries about it, but others in the same book do not. And one scribe might change his or her practice. And that's important to recall. On the one hand, the scattered pattern of their occurrence suggests that this concern with the texts persisting beyond the page was not limited to one genre or context. It really can crop up in all kinds of genres, even momentarily. It was an ever possible attitude. But on the other hand, the infrequency is an important reminder that the material page was mostly simply not attended to at all. That's because users of the codex soon learn what they're supposed, how they're supposed to read without thinking about the page edge too much. We're sort of almost naturalized to just ignoring it in our process. And in the few moments when scribes do think about the page break, as with orphans, overruns, or directions, what the scribes think about is how the text and its reading might transcend the page's material limits. That phrase, verte folium, which I mentioned earlier in the Book of Sermons, is the crucial clue. There's something needless about telling almost all readers to turn the leaf. We mostly know to do so. I suspect that the needlessness of that instruction betrays some anxiety about the material format. That nervousness seems evident whenever people refer to turning the leaf in a metatextual way in late medieval books. The phrase verte folium was very common in liturgical or music manuscripts, especially where there were musical texts which had different voices or parts that would continue at different lengths on different pages. The user of such a book would not want to mar the music or the liturgy by omitting to turn the leaf and complete the performance. There's a almost kind of J.L. Austen-y misfire that could happen there if you fail to complete the marriage service or something by turning the leaf, failing to read the declare part. So people refer to the material leaf in order to point out that you're not to be constrained by it when you're doing something with your voice. There's a sense of anxiety about orality in that phrase. There is something like that too when the phrase crops up, which it only rarely does in a few literary manuscripts. It tends to crop up when the textual structure is unclear because of some subsection or complicated structure. It occurs in a few copies of the Canterbury Tales, which is a really bitty and sort of patchy kind of a work, of course, where you have to move from tale to prologue to tale to prologue. In one, somebody ending the tale of Topaz writes at the end, finis verte folium. And I wasn't allowed to photograph that one. It's a select manuscript in the British Library. Similar are paraphrases which more loosely refer to the leaf, telling us to turn it, telling us to find the next instalment of the Canterbury Tales, as here, and in the next leaf beginneth the prologue of the cook, etc. So turn out, keep going, in some funny way, don't stop. As I keep saying, I suspect there's almost a kind of unease about too final a feeling you get at a page break. Anxiety about the material text is felt even in one final verte folium, my final example, also in a copy of the Canterbury Tales. This at first glance seems not to override the page break, but to emphasize it or to play with it. In one copy of the Canterbury Tales, most unusually and seemingly by fluke, a page break perhaps enhances, if that is possible, one of Chaucer's great comic denouements. At this point in The Miller's Tale, the lovesick clerk Absalom comes to the window of the woman he adores and is, in effect, stalking, and he woos her cooingly, "Sweater beard, spake sweater beard, I know to where thou art. Speak, sweet bird, I don't know where you are." But we've just learned that it's not Alison's face at the window, but the naked bottom of her lover, Nicholas, a trigger warning at this point for nudity and bodily functions. One reader writes beneath this last line on the page, between the declaration of love to a bottom, verte folium, or turn the leaf. I'd like to imagine, this is entirely unscholarly, I'd like to imagine that this was written by a teenage chorister, because he has the sense of humor of a teenage boy, and he also knows the phrase verte folium, which is very common primarily in liturgical music. It's as though he can't contain the excitement and wants us to turn over to reach the denouement and to find the rhyming line, "This Nicholas anon let fly a fart, this Nicholas anon let fly a fart," in the face of the poor Absalom. It's superb luck that in the flow of copying, this scribe has interrupted the tale just before its punchline. The material division into pages totally enhances the suspense of what might rhyme with art. Yet verte folium also seems worried that we might not keep reading. You can imagine that the choir master says to the boys in their dormitory, okay, that's enough for tonight. Stop reading now, we're going to bed. And he's like, no, no, keep going. This is in my fantasy scenario. Or that some other reader might stop at this point, foolishly, long enough to lose the rhyme and to lose the incongruity of rhyming an obscene word. The phrase also might remind us that reading was likely to be oral, as Joyce Coleman has said. And the metatextual quality of this note shows this person's recognition of the fact that the material structure of the book, even page breaks as fortuitously suspenseful as this, are arbitrary and must not interrupt the immaterial process of reading a text. Now that's interesting, because the Miller's Tale famously does exploit the division of literary works into separate leaves that hands can turn. In its prologue, Chaucer warns us that if we are prim, or like Absalom, rather squeamish of farting, as he says, we should turn over the leaf and choose another tale. That line has often been read as evidence that Chaucer exploited brilliantly the technology of the codex with its opportunity to flick back and forth and to choose, its affordances for non-continuous reading that have been celebrated in the history of reading and history of the book. But Chaucer's prologue is not describing a real book or a real reading process. It's imagining one fictionally, and it's doing so as a joke. Nobody could turn one leaf and choose a new, for the Miller's Tale always takes more than one leaf. It's pretty long. And Chaucer imagines that only some readers will avail themselves of this affordance of the codex to skip the rude bits. It's something to choose or chaise, not to be technologically determined. And the biggest joke, the point of his joke, is surely that most people will not choose to turn the leaf, but will read on salaciously. And so we should. Whoever wrote Verte Folium before the rude rhyme spotted correctly that the turnable leaf, the material page, is not usually an opportunity, but a distraction from the text which transcends the page in the mind or the ear or on the tongue. Getting caught up on the page as an artifact should not stop you reading. In my book, Immaterial Texts, I've tried to excavate from material evidence such as these odd scribal practices or readers' notes, ideas such as the wariness of page breaks, which informed the material process of making manuscripts and of handling and using them. Foremost among those ideas I suggest in the book is a concept of the text itself as somehow immaterial, not only a physical, but an ideational thing, not an ideal one, but ideational, as something for reading and performing as well. And this leads the makers themselves to be a bit vexed about the material text sometimes, though, as I've wanted to start by suggesting, not all the time. This complex ambivalence towards the material text, often in preference for immaterial ideas of the text, needs capturing historically, I think. And that in turn might reorient our own scholarly work methodologically. We might even learn from the scribes how to follow Juliet Fleming in, as she puts it, resisting the romance with matter that is currently turning literary criticism towards a love of things. Scribes and readers did not always love things. Sometimes they loved the immaterial text. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for that really wonderful and exciting talk. It really shows how, this kind of close reading, not just of the words on the page, but of the things that appear on the page that are placed there by the producers of the manuscripts can convey meaning. I think there are going to be lots of questions. The chat's been rather active, and I think buried within those, within the chat, I think there are some questions. So I'm scrolling through some of those.
Should I be scrolling through them? I can have a go at that.
Yeah, well, there's the first question is Christine Axon. If parchment is so, or Christine, if you would like to ask the question yourself, if you want to go ahead and.
I see that one, yeah.
Okay. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I am not a manuscript scholar, so I do have some questions about sort of the efficacy of keeping the margins so wide. And I understand, like in a gloss, obviously you would need to do that. And if it's like a sumptuous manuscript and you want to show consumption, fine. But we see so many kind of like scribbled off ones that still contain the two columns and then tons of margin. and they're not luxury books. So why waste space?
That's a really interesting point. And in fact, I slightly touch on that in a different chapter of the book. And I'm interested in the fact that there are conventions for making pages, which include a convention about the amount of blank space that should surround the page. It's weirdly consistent in the kind of Northwest European tradition of the book over, a millennium and a bit, really. So that's what's so strange. They just keep doing it. And I would even suggest that again has a non-functional relationship to non-functional kind of purpose, if you like, except it's just a sort of convention of making. I'm very much interested in the craftsperson and philosopher David Pye, who writes about the way that craftspeople follow conventions for no reason other than that's the way it's always been done. They have an idea in their head that's not in fact of very much material use whatsoever. Like, why do we make walls smooth? There's no reason. The walls don't need to be smooth. But we make walls smooth in our homes all the time. We plaster them. And he says that's just, people like geometric, tidy forms simply for the idea of it. And so actually I explore that a wee bit in a chapter on ruling and drawing up the space. But it is really weird, as you say. It's I think it's been calculated that something like 45% of most pages is blank, which is astonishing when you think of how many sheep had to be slaughtered horrifically and other creatures to make them. It's astonishing that he didn't use the space more. I mean, one or two people do, of course. There's always the exception, but usually not.
Because I work with charters, so we don't have any real margins. They just go on until
No.
they can't go on any further.
That's right, and they're interesting because those single sheet documents can be trimmed to fit and are trimmed to fit, aren't they? They're also, they sort of tend to be a bit more harmonized. So it wasn't beyond their wit to think about that.
So just
So
what
didn't
a book should look like.
Yeah.
Like what a book was done. That's fascinating. And so scratch my second question because you wound up answering it later.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Ray, you're first on my screen anyway.
Oh, sorry, is that okay? I only see Ada. Were you before me? Okay, so Daniel,
Hi, Ray.
again, thank you so much for an outstanding lecture. Two short plugs, one for your book. I just ordered it, the discount's wonderful, thank you. I hope it arrives soon. The other one is for Bruce Holsinger's book, which will be coming out from Yale University Press. And just what you were saying about the preciousness of parchment, he's dealing a lot with the materiality again and the whole process of getting from sheep to page. So kind of a precursor to some of what you're doing. So for those of you who don't know, great book coming out by Bruce Holsinger. So Daniel, in my context, I read a lot of books that are not literary, but liturgical. And for a different reason, then they often have notes about, go to page so-and-so because they've had to add something or subtract something from the liturgy. But I was really inspired by what you said about the sort of the Chaucer one in particular, where you're actually creating in your reader a certain emotion or reaction or something there. And I'm wondering, obviously this is not your topic at all, but just for you to speculate, those more kind of prosaic instructions in liturgical books and things like that, are they also serving to maybe disorient or in other ways to, shape the emotions of the people reading them?
Oh, so when they occur outside of liturgical context, you mean? That's a really good question.
I was thinking, we see them a lot in liturgical books where because you've had to add or subtract.
Yeah, and because there are often things like different voices, or you say, well, we're combining this bit of the office from here and this anthem from there, and so they have a lot of directions like that, kind of cues, and those things do pop up in vernacular literary books, often in the context of correcting the text when things have had to be added on an extra leaf or at the back, or there's been some misbinding, even misbinding within the Middle Ages, though of course some of it's post-medieval, but misbinding in the Middle Ages. So the word leaf, as far as I can find, in all this, when I keep searching for it, crops up most often when something's gone wrong and people are saying, no, it's on another leaf, or the leaves are out of order. So that in the copies of the Canterbury Tales, for instance, it's often used when there's some sort of hiccup like that. So it is an occasion in which there's already a disorientation in almost the literal sense of spatial awareness. You need to go to a different bit of the book and find this, that, or the other. So that's quite striking. It often accompanies a sense of unease in a way, but it's designed. I guess it's been used to try and smooth over that and tidy up the disorderliness. but there are many more instances of people referring to leaves in Canterbury Tales, as well as the verse folium one that I talked about, but often in occasions of disruption. You mentioned Bruce Holsinger's book, which I am on tenterhooks to read. So my book has a chapter about repairs to parchment, and this was sort of, went to press in July, and so I've been sat there sort of like, irked. As always, the timing is a nightmare, and you're like, if only I could have read that first and put this in, but they'll have to sit side by side, and it'd be interesting to see what happens. I should plug as well another book on parchment and called Sustainability and Recycling, in the late medieval English book by Hannah Riley, Ryley. She's my Oxford colleague. She's a postdoc in Oxford, and that's all about, it's an argument that medieval scribes were essentially sort of a sustainable ecologists avant la lettre, in that they had to be sparing with their resources. They had to be prudent, and that they repair and restore and conserve and reuse quite a lot. So so her book and Bruce Holsinger's book will be, I think, kind of transforming parchment studies this summer in the way that Orietta de Rol's book on paper did about a year or so ago. So I think it's going to be much easier for people to study the materials of late medieval texts now, with some interesting reflections on them by Bruce Holsinger, Hannah Riley, Orietta de Rol, and probably others I'm forgetting.
Yes, but I love the way that you're taking this in your own direction. I mean, Bruce is very much involved in the physical in a way, but your literary is really exciting. So I can't wait, as you say, to read them as a triptych.
Well, I mean, in my chapter, I've referred to Bruce Holsinger on the parchment. I referred to Bruce Holsinger's great past publications about the ethics of parchment, which I found totally. I remember they first came out around 2008 or 9. I found totally chastening and amazing. And so I open by saying, first things first, like a moment of acknowledgement. Yes, like and that's kind of an awfulness about that. And then I say, I'm going to now look at repairing it and whatnot. So I say, it sort of goes off in a slightly different tangent, but I sort of begin by saying that's all there, all true, and kind of all awful in both senses of the word.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ada, I was muted when I was talking, but go ahead, please. I think we are not hearing you for some reason.
So
Oh, there you go. Okay.
yes, okay.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you for that beautiful talk. And I had kind of a large question and then maybe kind of a comment, who knows, maybe it's a question. The larger question is that, it seems like this work really maps onto a vast literature on a shift or a relationship from orality to literacy. And I was wondering how your ideas about immateriality kind of fall into that discussion, because it seems like they're really interesting implications for it. And the second was that I was thinking about that mention of charters in the first question. And it seems like a really interesting case study in what you're talking about, because they are documents on a page, but then they get written into cartularies, right? The 12th, 13th century onwards. And so you're taking these page documents into codex form. And I'm wondering how these, how the layout might change, between the pages once they're in the codex form.
Wow, two questions. So the first one I definitely have an answer to, and the second one I have to admit a bit of ignorance or relative lack of ignorance. First one, the orality to literacy. I would generally see this period as not shifting from orality to literacy. I'm very persuaded by the work of Joyce Coleman of the University of Oklahoma, who stresses aurality, reading aloud from codices. So not minstrels, pointy shoes reciting, but reading from the codex to other people. I mean, even as late as the early 19th century, if you think of the Jane Austen era, we have visions of sociable reading aloud as being quite a common practice outside of scholarly settings anyway, for the vernacular texts that I'm mostly looking at. So I would see reading aloud as the absolutely crucial context for much of what I'm looking at. If you're reading aloud, you want that reading to be sort of harmonious. There are a couple of points today when I had to move my sheets of my notes, and I was like breaking my own sentences between bits of paper. We all know that experience, right? So, and it looks like it has a very practical use to worry about the page when you've got that experience of reading aloud. So I would see this as not so much shifting that much, and still a very thriving oral culture. And there are other ways in which from memorized texts, for instance, in textual transmission, that one might think about immaterial texts in a very practical way in this period. Charters and catuleries is a great question. I'm really, single sheet documents, that question earlier from Christine Axon was, just really got me thinking, and think, oh, I've only had a chapter on that. But that's a great point, because then their layout does change. And I suppose that what's interesting is that the single sheet charter, I guess in the sort of the post-Clanchy work of the last few decades, it has a kind of, the materiality is so important for its social function. The object is a kind of mnemonic. It's a kind of, it's how we talk about how to do things with words, how to do things with a bit of skin and with some ink. It has a kind of a very real world effect. Thinking about the work on seals as well by Brigitte Bellon-Schrejac. But what's odd is that when you put in a cartouillerie, all of that can go. They can straddle page breaks, they can be jumbled up together. There's not usually a seal. There are a few poems such as the Charter of Christ with fake seals drawn on, but like they're really kind of niche freak examples. But you just shed all that materiality, but the words suddenly have a force otherwise. So cartouilleries would be a contrast between charters and cartouilleries would be great. But I say all that having only ever looked at a dozen cartouilleries. I don't tend to work on them very much, which is bad on my part, but tells you about disciplinary divides. But that would be an amazing way of thinking about that. I'd want to go and check what Jessica in Cambridge, my brain is gone. Wrote the great book about documentary art. What she says about that. She's at the University of Cambridge, and I can't. Her surname has escaped my brain. It's Friday evening here, so but she does talk a little bit about the imaging of charters inside other texts, and that she might touch on that, I think. But it will be a great topic to explore further. There's another place where the materiality is sometimes so important, and then sometimes apparently not, like in some odd way.
There's another question from Alajan Oskirol.
Yeah, hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this lecture. I really appreciated it. I learned a lot. My own interests are in paragraphing and paragraph marks from incunabula onto, or late medieval incunabula into like the 17th century when it becomes a really ubiquitous process. And I'm not sure if I should cluster, the capitula or the pilcrow with page breaks. But in line with Juliet Fleming's book that you cited at the end, Cultural Graphology, I'm wondering if there's an unspoken grammar to these marks or lack of marks. More specifically, Juliet stresses that we don't know what writing is, at least in her enunciations of Derrida's argument. And that might be especially useful combined with Laurie McGuire's Rhetoric of the Page, where essentially blanks are also writing. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of derive or assume a grammar or grammatology of these forms. I know it's like super dangerously close to formalism, but also I don't know if that matters. And it's my impression that the marks, both page breaks and pilcrows and capitula, are rarely self-referred to, but still everywhere. And so that's about my question.
So by rarely self-referred to, you mean the text seldom comments on their presse? Yeah,
they're everywhere.
Yeah. No, that's right. That's like a lot of these features. Some of these features, I've had to go to Moxon in the 1680s, is it, to find a word for them. And you think they must have said, do that thing there. And what do they say? Like, I don't know what they said. They just don't write it down. It's so annoying. Cross people don't. They work orally and they work by learned example. But that's a great point. I think we could definitely try and create a kind of sort of spatial grammar for white space, for breaking, for paraph marks certainly, but things like those overruns of text in the bottom margin often have a paraph or some other kind of thing, a bit like a paragraphus, some other sort of punctuation mark. So we could definitely do that. I think I sort of slightly almost plagiaristically used the phrase grammar of legibility at one point in my talk without acknowledging Malcolm Parks. And definitely he's got this great term that he uses for all of those features of the page, from white space, this sort of Paul Sanger style space between words, but white space all over the place, punctuation marks, whatnot. as being crucial for articulating sense and clarity. So those are things where those material features, even white spaces, material features, it's got stuff underneath it. That they do have and there are some clear rules. I've got this great colleague, Elizabeth Solopova, who always says there were rules governing these things, but we just haven't worked out what they are yet. And she's very sort of, adamant that, she's like, oh, you can't say it's ambiguous. There's always going to be a rule somewhere. And she's probably right, I think. And so I think we could definitely do that. Paragraphing is a great topic. Really, I'd be really interested to hear about that, because the paragraph is used sometimes of what looks like a paragraph in Middle English prose, but then at other points not. But you think, it's unclear when that starts to become formalizing into paragraphing. I look forward to learning more about that from work on early printing.
Thank you.
That's a great topic. Yes, we should definitely think about blank space as having a kind of a meaningfulness too, and a sort of being akin to writing.
Thank you so much, especially with what you said about your colleague. There's rules that we just don't know about yet.
Yeah. That's right. And it's hard to, do we reconstruct them by a kind of big data project? We just scrunch all the examples and they're going to emerge sometimes. And some of these things we sort of overlook, I think, because they themselves don't comment on them. I think there's been no prompt to look at them, as you say, with paragraphs and whatnot, and Pilcrow or something. So.
Thank you so much.
Are there other questions from the audience? Jermaine Workington, I see that you, did you have a question, or did you want to make a comment, or were you just sharing something in the chat? I don't know if you want to expand on that. Perhaps not. I have a question, and I don't want to sound like a skeptic, because this is a question that I've had a lot when people talk about scribes and how much they understand how the production of the thing that they're writing, how much of a sort of bird's eye view do they have of what's going to happen once they start a book and then finish it, like what's happening in between that. And I'm thinking, we published an article in Manuscript Studies by Dominic Warner, and I'm forgetting the details of this, but there was a hole in the page of the parchment. And he was arguing that this hole that was made by the scribe, and when you look through that hole, the word that was on that next page revealed something about what was being said on the preceding page. And there was a lot of skepticism about, how could a scribe do that? Except that the argument was, it was too coincidental not to have some kind of value to it. And I was thinking, as you, in the examples that you were showing of the sort of directional cues that weren't catchwords, the fake catchwords, that there is a sense that, when a scribe is writing a page and he finishes a page, is he necessarily turning to the next page? Or is there this sort of sequence of writing, I'm going to write all the rectos first, then I'll go back and do all the versos. And so in that sense, you might want to make sure that the text that you're putting on the back of a page is actually the continuation, because you're not necessarily writing, a scribe is not necessarily writing continuously, to the best of my understanding, all the time. So I wonder if you have controls for that sort of circumstance.
That's a great point. So a couple of things. Firstly, on the practical point of how often did scribes write out of sequence, I'd be interested to know what others think about this, but my sense is that that's pretty rare. So there are a few examples where they almost seem to have written, is it by sort of imposition, or as we could say, by imposition order in early printing? And there are a few examples of that. They're almost all very, very common liturgical texts, of which a workshop would know it was going to be able to sell several copies. And I think the number of verified examples so far is 44 from the entirety of the Middle Ages. It's pretty rare. So there would be problems with doing, so that seems less likely, especially in prose and in vernacular prose. There would be not much occasion for that kind of forward planning, I think. And prose makes it really hard to predict where you're going to write. The difference would be dividing up texts between people. There are many instances where scribes have collaborated, and then often that division just in prose, it just goes completely wrong. There's a great one in Durham University Library in the UK where a set of nuns in Suffolk copied up, what's it called? The Doctrine of the Heart communally. They each had a choir, and it just is a total disaster because some of them have big handwriting and some of them have small handwriting, and none of the bits match up, and it's just a nightmare. So they don't do that very often, and when they do, it goes a bit pear-shaped. So that's maybe not the context, but I think actually that's a really good point about them not having a kind of an overview, a kind of bird's eye view or oculocentric kind of perspective on their task. I don't think they very often did, with a few exceptions. I mean, there are a few kind of total artists. I often have an interest in humanistic manuscripts, and there are a few scribes, humanistic scribes, who clearly are mapping out the whole thing in advance as a kind of work of art. I mean, and there'll be, you know, if I were an art historian, I'd probably have zillions of examples of this. But I think with vernacular texts, it's often much more day to day. So there could be cues, as you say, those directions could be cues, pick up here tomorrow, though that's in itself revealing that writing is discontinuous and that there's a risk that when you do that, you get it wrong. They don't make that mistake very often in copying at page breaks. It's very seldom that they duplicate text over page breaks. I've been looking for this for quite a long number of years, and I don't really very often find it, but it must have been a bit baffling, like where have you got to kind of thing. But I think for me that those directions for the future are revealing of the fact that scribes themselves are kind of working not with an overview, but very much moment by moment in a kind of improvisatory way. And central to that improvisatory feel is the fact they're inconsistent in it. So somebody will copy, say, 600 folios of Trefisa and do those on 85-ish pages, I think it was, 85, 86. So it's a kind of an occasional, oh, now it would be handy if I did that. Oh, but then next page, I'm just not going to bother, even though a word is split over the page break. It's a little bit, happens sort of random. Can then what look like amazing, meaningful effects occur? They sometimes do. So, I mean, I cheekily chose some places referring to the side of the C for where they were turning to the other side of the leaf. But that's me selecting 2 out of 86 examples or whatever that happen to be amusingly almost self-referential. And in the chapter on parchment, I mischievously chose a load of examples where words such as hole or skin or wound were next to holes in the parchment. And I leave them in at the end. I say, that's all entirely random. Like none of those people planned that. That's just, but there were zillions of other holes which had words like, I don't know, like house and fish or something totally unrelated next to them. So I think that accidental things happen. And for readers, those are really there. Like they're really there. If just because something happens by accident doesn't mean that the effect isn't very real. But I don't think scribes usually are planning that far ahead. I see them feeling their way page by page, or rather choir by choir, as they go more often. On those accidents that become meaningful, there's just an amazing chapter. So my colleague Adam Smythe, whom I mentioned fleetingly in his book, Material Texts in Early Modern England, he talks about some binding fragments that accidentally echo the wording of the text that they are binding. And he says, this is totally an accident. No, this was surely just grabbed off this binder's shelf of pile of old leaves, because they were doing dozens of them by the day, and the same text appears in 48 unrelated books where no links can be drawn. So, but once it's there, it can't be unseen. That's a great point. You know, so for the early modern reader who saw that binding, it was there, but it doesn't mean it was intended. So it's he's got a really good compromise, I think, on how to deal with those things. It's a very, very clever book.
Yeah, and I always think that there, like with anything and with human activity, there are people who are just masters of their craft.
Yeah,
and they can probably think this far ahead. But most people are just not thinking.
No, that's right. I think, and for me, I always think one of the key things I was trying to think when I'm teaching students about scribes as well is about temporality. Books were not made all at once. It was a long process over several days. When you look at stints of ink change from the evidence of ink changing, the stints, they're often like 3 folios, at the most 10 pages or something like that. I was doing this in a class this Wednesday, actually. But they're moving through time, and their attitudes will change over time. I think we should think about medieval literature that way as well, actually. Something that changed over time in the writing, often without a sort of sense of the big picture, because they couldn't zoom out as we literally can on Word, where you can have like all 4 pages on screen at once. They couldn't do find and replace place. There's less of a global vision. There's a much more experiential and improvisatory process of making, I think. So that sounds very airy to put it like that, but I think that's actually much more concrete in a way, despite my airy terms.
Absolutely, thank you. Any more questions? Have I missed anything in the chat? I don't think I have.
Some useful comments, by the way, from people about terms orphans and widows. Really helpful. I tied myself in knots. And also, by the way, the Oxford English Dictionary, which I have great respect, the entries for orphan and widow contradict each other. So I'm glad that even OUP, and one of the world's great presses, is in a total muddle about this as well. So I don't feel so bad. But yeah, it's a real challenge to work out how to use those terms, because they're used very inconsistently. So thank you for warning about that. And they are still the bane of book formatters, as we know.
Orphans have no past and widows have no future. Barbara Ellickson writes.
Yes.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much. This was, as someone said in the notes, a very pleasurable way to have lunch or afternoon coffee or breakfast, depending on where you are, and to end in the week and in the series on such a high note. Again, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming and for your interest, and we will see you in the fall.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the great questions.